Welcome back. We've now arrived at the closing plenary of the New Shape Forum. This, of course, is not the end of the proceedings because after lunch we do have brainstorming session to discuss more of the ideas from the small group discussions. We also have a side event. But we've come to the closing plenary of our dialogue today. And just to set the stage, to take from what was said at the opening plenary and to borrow an investor's phrase, this conference has been so far about so much more than weapons governance. It's been actually about the active management of our global governance assets rather than the passive management of them, which is what we've been doing. We've taken the conversation on weapons governance to completely uncharted spaces, from climate to sustainable development to big data companies, and tried to really get together a pool of or a roster of expertise from across domains to make strategic and impactful interventions, come up with coalitions of different stakeholders on countermeasures and complex modeling and enforcement. At our closing plenary today, we will go through some of the ideas that were developed at the small group discussions, and this conversation will be led. I'm very pleased and delighted to welcome on stage the moderators, Dr. Patricia Lewis, who we all know from the first day's proceedings, as well as Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who is the Distinguished Fellow for Observer Research Foundation. Ambassador Sood was the diplomat who set up the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division within India's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was India's first ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament. Welcome both, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all of you. So we thought we might start with just a couple of small reflections from ourselves about the meeting. I think it's been a really interesting meeting. It's gathered together a wide range of experience, a wide range of disciplines, of views, of people. It's brought the international to the regional to the local. And I think everyone's been able, because of the structure of it, I think everyone's been able to have their voice heard within the meeting. I think it's been very, very useful in that regard. What about you, Rakesh? How do you feel about it?
Sure, I agree with you. I think when Richard first broached the idea, we weren't very clear because while on one hand we were looking at established weapons like nuclear weapons, but on the other hand we were also looking at new technologies and how they would figure in. So in that sense, the idea of governance stories, of bringing in experiences from other new areas and how they have impacted society and what lessons do they offer us in terms of new technologies and so on, I think it's fascinating. That's been probably a very, very rewarding and rich menu to take back from.
Looking at it from the viewpoint of governance as well, rather than very sort of legalistic approaches or just soft law approaches or so on. It's just having that whole mix in there and trying to find things that actually work, I think is the critical thing. So what we're going to do now is we're going to interrogate one by one the rapporteurs from the breakout sessions. So what that means is they're going to do a presentation of their discussion for about 5 minutes or so, and then we're going to just ask them a few questions. And then at the end of that, we're going to sort of open up to a broader discussion in the room. So if we could have the rapporteur from Group 1, which I think is the man himself, Richard Linnane, that would be great.
Richard, welcome to the hot seat.
Hot seat, interrogation, I mean, I feel comfortable.
It's very Monty Python, isn't it?
It is. Well, it's nice to see everybody. Okay, so, well, our group was on delegation, distribution and coordination, and it's perhaps the group that was famous for people not really being clear what it was about. But we had some very wide-ranging discussions about what that meant, and more importantly, what we were going to do with it. And it was perhaps the most abstract of the discussion groups, but that's good because some of these issues really do need a very broad-based approach. So we looked at the question of a lot about linkages, and in looking at the linkages between these different issues, we came up with this sort of dichotomy of these two grammars or languages when we're talking about weapons governance. And that is that for some countries, some governments, some people, it's very much a zero-sum game. National security is, it's a national issue. My security perhaps comes at the expense of yours. And so that's one grammar, that's the very traditional security-based approach. The other grammar is security and disarmament and so on as a global public good, as a global commons. And this is perhaps how the sort of founding idea of the United Nations, that disarmament and peace and so on is a global good that we pursue together collectively. But these two different grammars, these two different languages don't fit together very well, and perhaps that is driving many of the problems that we see, and it's acting against making these links with other areas, because while it would be perhaps easier to do things at a regional level or to do things to make connections with issues like environment or public health, if you're working from this sort of national security language, it's much more difficult to make those kinds of connections. So we talked about how can we bridge these two dialects, these two sort of philosophies, if you like. And after a lot of discussion, we came up with the idea that perhaps the way to tackle this difference is to look at risk. Risk would be the bridge. And this fits very nicely with the Global Challenges Foundation's approach of dealing with global catastrophic risks. But that risk reduction or risk management would be a way that we can speak both these languages and translate between them and make links so that we can find practical actions that can be supported by both the speakers of language 1 and the speakers of language 2. What exactly would we do then to do that? Well, one idea is it is a research question. That is, this is something that researchers and academics could take up, is looking at techniques to deal with risk and to sell these, if you like, to the two camps. Then we also had some more practical examples of things that are actually being done now, and Andy Webber kindly shared the work of his organisation on building track 2 dialogue and discussions between the big nuclear armed states, for example, on reducing nuclear risk, focusing on very specific areas, specific types of weapons that they think pose the greatest concern. We also looked at the concept of I can't say this word, subsidiarity. That is, actions being taken other than at the national or top level or the global level. One quite fruitful line of discussion we had was looking at the prospect for regional action. How can we get regional organisations more involved? And importantly, can regional action be a bridge to making these better links at the global level? So can you, by sort of delegating things down from the global level to the regions, can you deal with things there and then bring them back up? Like many, I think we had this discussion of, do we need the Greta? Who is the Greta Thunberg for disarmament? There are different views on that, but there was a very good metaphor that came up saying, these sort of high-level things. Another question was, why isn't there a big global conference on disarmament or weapons governance like we see in climate change and health and so on? And the answer to both these questions is, well, you can't just have the tip of the iceberg. You need to have the big part of the iceberg that's under the water. You need to build that up first before then you're in a position to be ready to take advantage when Greta appears. Or you want to convene a conference. And we thought that regional activities would be a good way to prepare for that. It would be a good way to bring, to try and make these links with issues like environment and public health. It may be easier to do that through regional organisations than at the global level. Patricia, in fact, came up with the idea of one way of starting this would be to use the annual meeting of nuclear weapon-free zones as a way to kick off a regional-based discussion or series of regionally based discussions on disarmament more broadly. There was one other specific thing we did discuss was the role of finance. As some of you know, we did originally have a separate discussion group planned for finance, but had to be cancelled. There, again, there's obviously some very specific things that can be done, and one particular idea that came out was looking not just at capital flows and investments, but also at loans. So using, working with banks to use the availability of lending to influence decisions on weapons governance. I think that's about it. It was a very wide-ranging discussion. I can't do it justice in 5 minutes, but if there are any particular questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Thanks, Richard. I was very drawn to the idea of regional action to global action. And one of the things that I've heard about in the conference and also in the few minutes that I was popping into here, the group discussion, was the issue of ownership. And we heard Lema yesterday talk about the issues at the grassroots level and how important it is to engage at that level. But there's always this feeling, isn't there, that somehow there's a level, there's a hierarchy, that we have to go to the grassroots, then up to the regional, and then up to the global. Is this going to create the feeling of ownership, do you think, or is there a better way that we could think about this?
We did discuss pretty much exactly that question, because one of the things that came up is, at the grassroots level, or looking at younger people, for example, why aren't they interested in disarmament and international security? And someone pointed out, well, they're interested in social justice, they're interested in the environment, and they're interested in jobs. This is key concerns for everybody. How can we make these kinds of issues relevant to them? But we thought it has to go both ways. I mean, education was something we'd also discussed, I should have mentioned before. So we should do more on education on these kinds of issues, disarmament, weapons governance. But there's a very good quote, if I can find it, that education without action falls flat. And it's no good educating and raising awareness of people if you're not also developing channels for them to sort of act on that, use that knowledge. So we thought it had to go all ways. It's not just sort of going from global to regional to local. It also has to go local, regional, global, and back and forth. And by slowly building a bigger sort of body of both knowledge and of interest in action that we're going to get anywhere.
I like the idea that you started with, the idea of changing of the two grammars of security having been seen as a zero-sum game and converting it to a global commons. So we see it, and then you said that risk management or risk reduction is perhaps the bridge which we can use. But here, I mean, I don't know, and maybe later on we can dwell a little bit on it, but the thought that comes to me is that risk from established weapons, say nuclear weapons, which have been around for more than 70 years, is a more easily quantifiable, understandable risk. Lots of people have written about it, nuclear winter, etc., etc. On the other hand, when you look at new technologies, you actually don't really know how you're going to quantify or manage, because you can't describe the risks. I mean, we were in one of the groups, we were having a discussion that in 1990s, how would you have looked at the internet? How would you have looked at Google? Would you have described it as something risky, or would you have described it as something worth pursuing? So, I mean, and this is 1990s. I mean, even today we have difficulties in coming to a definition of risk with some of these new technologies. But it would be interesting. I don't know if you had any discussions along these lines.
We did. I mean, one of the things that came up a couple of times was the problem of, I guess the best expression of it is complacency. which is in itself a risk, but that the risks go distant. And as was pointed out in our group, there are now many people. It's only the older generation who remember, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis and how very close we came to global catastrophe, and that because somebody sort of said jokingly, like we should have an accident every 5 years just to keep people remind. But that's it. That you do have this problem of gradually growing complacency. So I think perhaps it's in our group we thought that it wasn't the case that the risks of nuclear weapons, for example, are very well understood. That the understanding gradually decreases over time as we get further away from the bad things that have happened. And so it's really quite a similar situation. It's a largely unknown risk with nuclear weapons, and we have, as you say, Rakesh, all these new threats and developments and inventions, technology coming where we really don't have a way to categorize the risk at all yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next is the inclusion and agency of non-state actors. Whoever is the rapporteur. Oh yeah, sorry, well done. Who's the rapporteur for Group 2? Great. Hi, Ben. Ben, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi.
Ben Donaldson from the United Nations Association of the UK. I didn't realise I'd be sort of barracked on either side by interrogators, but we'll do our best. We had a really initially a very broad discussion about the inclusion of non-state actors and looking at some examples of where it's worked and where it hasn't worked. But our host this morning said it was about coming up with a model, so we wanted to really use the time today to make it as tangible as possible. So we've come up with something that I hope is going to satisfy that criteria, which is I'll just leap straight in there with the end point and then kind of talk you through it. It is a declaration on collaborative weapons governance. So the thinking behind this is that across, we've heard from so many different sectors today, anything from biotechnology through to ethical AI and all of the problems that those present. But, we're kind of working in different sectors, and this is quite disparate. But there's a few things that I think we can all unite on when it comes to governance of weapons and emerging threats. And that's that currently civil society is adding so much value to the sort of arena of work, and yet many of the decision-making structures are still totally dominated by states. So it's actually, there's a positive case for greater civil society involvement here, because kind of, the states need civil society and business to be on side, yet they're not letting states and civil society into the room. They're not giving them a seat around the table. So our declaration would be quite simply pointing out the evidence base that's already out there, collecting that together, making the compelling case for civil society to be kind of almost on equal footing with states when it comes to weapons governance. We talked in our group about the field work that goes into that went into the Landmines Convention, and how we've heard that that's often more accurate and more detailed than the sort of work that states can the sort of information that states provide themselves. We've also heard about the special rapporteurs and the Human Rights Council, the extent to which they rely on the data and for instance, on drone strikes by various different actors. We've also heard about the ICANN campaign and how that put civil society and advocacy to such great success in creating, really shifting the dial on a new norm, a legally binding treaty against nuclear weapons, to prohibit nuclear weapons. But yet, despite this huge wealth of evidence, we're still seeing that conferences, delegations are entirely made up of states, and governance structures are entirely dominated by states. So in a nutshell, the declaration would focus on three things. One is a fair floor time pledge. So when the Google executives who have a lot to add to the CCW discussions on killer robots turn up, they don't speak at the end of the day and are only given 5 minutes. And so this fair floor time pledge is something we would ask international organizations, states to sign up to, so that, you know, given the evidence-based, if civil society are putting in so much value, then they should be recognized by that, and, you know, they should speak earlier on in proceedings, and we'd ask conferences and processes to respect that. The second one is asking states to fill their delegations not just up of diplomats, but actually of businesses, of civil society, and of academics who have something to add. So that spirit of collaboration. We looked at the example of the ILO, which already has a tripartite system of governance with businesses, with workers, and with governments all joining their delegations. And then the big bang sort of endpoint for the declaration is a new model for collaborative weapons governance. And this would actually be, I mean, it would probably be a series of individual campaigns looking at different processes and different structures, but it would be asking for a seat at the decision-making table intrinsically built into the makeup of each organization. You know, you see member states defining the direction that UN organizations and other global governance organizations take. We would actually want a civil society seat at that table. So I don't know what the split would be, but, you know, it would be different for different organizations. And so that's the principle of the Declaration on Collaborative Weapons Governance. We also talked about a few principles for how to get there. There's a lot we can learn from different civil society campaigns. I can quickly whiz through them very quickly. So it's, first of all, it's around the idea of not tackling problems head-on necessarily. There's often a way around the problem that you need to think creatively about. Second, finding your champion countries. It's very rare to have a big global governance initiative take off without having some countries on side. Thirdly, single-issue campaigns can be really useful. So it could be that this could be, you know, split up into different chunks, and sort of you'd have a campaign for the fair floor time pledge, and take that forward, because that's something that you could really unite a lot of the grievances of civil society under that banner, and yet those civil society organizations could continue their existing work streams, and, you know, just keep zeroing in on a single issue can be useful for that. For decentralization, so if you are going to take up this cause, you need, it's such a big thing that you're going to need to be decentralized, and you're going to need to be self-organizing in the way that different things will work in different regions, and you wouldn't want to sort of presume to know how to campaign and how to sort of get change in different regions. So the idea of it would need to be self-organizing. Lastly, penultimately, humanitarian is a good way in terms of it can be less politicized, and we've seen from the history of the humanitarian disarmament movement that's a great way to get traction based on real sort of human stories, and the actual harm that these weapons could either do pose or could pose in the future. And lastly, it's the Nike principle: don't ask for permission, just do it. Here we go.
Okay. I mean, clarion call. But, I mean, how do you get about getting a seat at the decision-making table? I mean, let's see, there would be a number of people here, delegates from the Conference on Disarmament. So you have, 65 countries? So, I mean, practically speaking, what would you say? You've got 192 countries in the UNGA. I mean, practically speaking, what would you say? Expand it to give 60 more? Or secondly, when you talk of civil society, I mean, who organizes civil society? Well, countries, so China will send its own civil society representatives, Russia will send its own, Britain will send its own, and so on. But champion country, which champion? I mean, did you have, I'm sure you would have had a discussion on what champion. I'd be glad to hear about what's the kind of champions you're looking at for spearheading an initiative like this.
Wow. Wow, there's some real details there. I thought I'd give my pitch, and then that would be it.
Detail is what we want, Ben.
So in terms of the conference on disarmament's a funny one, because obviously it's been moribund for so long. States haven't managed to get it going. So this is something that has failed at every other level. I was chatting to Richard yesterday, and I was saying, well, the subversive way for civil society to go about this one is to organize its own conference on disarmament.org and host it in Geneva and just do it without the states initially, or do it with some progressive states and start sending out...
So we can see a champion sitting right there.
We've got our platform right here, the Geneva platform.
Okay.
And just have some fun with it, because it's something that needs some playfulness added to it. That particular question is such a hard question. And then, you know, if you had a group of states who are already who are equally frustrated with proceedings as civil society and anyone who supports disarmament is, you can imagine that they might want to join that sort of an initiative, and it's kind of a way around the problem. We were talking about that principle.
But hasn't that been tried with the Landmines Convention or with the Nuclear Ban Convention?
I think this is a bit different. So yes, you're right. The Landmines has, I wouldn't call it equal time. States speak first and non-states speak second.
Or nuclear ban.
And same the ban. But I think that so I'm interested in the ILO and what you said about the ILO and the way the delegations include academics, private sector, and so on. Because in the end, what we're always told is, of course, that states make the decisions and states are accountable to their populations. That may or may not be true, of course, but that's what we're told. And therefore, you know, the problem with non-governmental organizations is they don't have really any accountability except to their funders, maybe if their membership they have to that, but not to the people they supposedly represent. So I'm interested in this. We've also seen it in internet governance, the multi-stakeholder process, which I know when everybody hears the word multi-stakeholder, they don't like it, so let's find another name, but it means the same thing. It's about people who have a stake in the decision being represented. That's what it means. So I like the word collaborative. So how does the ILO actually work when they bring in these types of delegations?
The ILO traditionally has always had government, employer, labor.
Yeah.
But the governments choose, I mean, their industry association chooses the employer delegation,
right.
The labor unions choose the labor delegation, and the government has the Ministry of Labor delegations. That's how that's been the structure for the ILO decision-making since its inception.
So we could think of something equivalent, similar.
And it was my understanding that whilst decisions may take a bit longer to negotiate at the ILO, as a result of the problems being sort of headed off earlier on in, you know, during negotiations, they actually tend to be more successful going forward, because it's not suddenly something that's like lamped on the desk of business and suddenly they have to do something that they haven't been, you know, invested in the process along the way. So that, I mean, that's one potential way.
And that's true, by the way, with internet governance. It takes forever to make a decision, but everyone's involved so that eventually the decision is understood very well. I mean, it's an interesting idea.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
So now group 3, the data and monitoring group. Sibylla, I think that's you. Do you want to introduce yourself, Sibylla?
Yes, sure, happy to do that. My name is Phillip Bauer. I'm from SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, where I'm Director of Studies for Armament Disarmament. And I would like to start by thanking the group for everybody's very active participation. And I'd also like to thank Ruben, who was a note taker. And sorry to put you a bit on the spot, but you introduced yourself as just a student, and I sort of reacted to that. Because we talk a lot here about next generation and bringing in new Greta, which means we actually need to give some space and actually also airtime maybe in future to younger people. I'm sure they have some great ideas about weapons governance and how we could be taking that forward. And I'd also like to thank James Revel from Unidia, who brilliantly produced the summary of yesterday's discussion to make sure that we could actually build on that for today, and also helped me to put together the recommendations that we came up with. So the brief from the organizers was to be very concrete and very specific. So we came up with 2 very concrete ideas to take forward. The first one based on the assumption that data are an essential part of governance. So the first step is to know what to govern and to map data that would be useful to have for weapons governance. So the first step would be to identify what's there and what's not there, what are the gaps, and why. Is that for national security reasons, for commercial confidentiality, because there's a lack of capacity, and so on and so forth. And we had a discussion about what kind of data are there, breaking it down by the weapons types. So starting with the conventional weapons, there's quite a bit on weapons trade, but not everything. There's less on acquisition, on possession, and on the use of weapons. We also had a discussion that it would be good to have more disaggregated data on military spending, in particular with regards to how the government spends on research and technology. And moving on from conventional weapons, how can we capture what's happening in emerging technologies and also with non-conventional arms, nuclear, biological, chemical? There we thought it would need to be much broader. So areas and potential data areas to look at would be defense research funding, personnel, facilities, oversight mechanisms, research trends looking at publications, so bibliometrics, investment flows, and also patent data. And what was also quite interesting is that we thought we learned a lot from what was happening in the biofield. So the biofield seems more advanced in terms of looking at trends in emerging tech, which is not so much happening in the nuclear area, where a lot of the data we have is much more focused on quantitative, not so much qualitative, and how it links to emerging technology trends. And also in the conventional arms area, that's not something that we have focused on so far. So we can actually learn a lot from the biofield in this issue area. So once we've mapped, which would be quite a big project, at what's there, what kind of data could be available and should be available, the question then is who provides the data? And we came up with 4 categories of data providers. You have international organizations, governments, civil society, and companies. And we concluded that these are not one or the other, but they are complementary data providers. Each have their role because the data also have different functions and they have different associations in relation to credibility and authority. So it depends on if you want to use data to inform decision makers, use data to inform investors so they can make better decisions or informed decisions, to hold governments to account for their actions, or to identify new risks. And we also had a discussion about the way data are presented, so giving thought to the formatting, the presentation, and making them user-friendly and accessible. And we also had a discussion about capacity. So some data are not available because governments don't have the capacity or because research organizations don't have the capacity to do that. So it's also about resource allocation. And we discussed the target audience, to what extent you need to have in mind who actually wants to use the data for what purpose. So you can reverse engineer what kind of data you want to produce. Then moving on to the second specific recommendation, that was on company reporting. And we talked about 2 ways. One about having more data available by asking companies to provide them, and the second to increase the responsibility of companies as a part of governance. So one idea was that there could be an obligation or a sort of code of conduct with principles that ask governments to conduct risk assessments for technologies that they produce and have a system in place to look at potential uses of those technologies. And that could be connected to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, because there's a lot of momentum already ongoing with regard to sustainability reporting. So linking it specifically to that could be one way to make the most out of that momentum. And there was also a suggestion to look at Scope 3 effects. So governments would be responsible for effects of the products further downstream and apply that also to potential uses of the technology for military purposes. And we had a discussion about incentivizing divestments, so on and so forth. And again, pulling across one idea from the biofield would be to ask companies to look at reasonably foreseeable consequences. So those are the two specific ideas that we came up with. I just want to actually throw out a third one very briefly that was raised yesterday, but not today, but the person who raised them wasn't here today. It would actually be gender disaggregated data. And it makes me think about it because we don't have a full gender balance in this room, and that's actually very common in the tech world. So maybe there's something we could also give more thought to.
Thanks
That's
a lot,
it.
Sibylle. Thank you very much.
So what about the monitoring part? I mean, you said the data and the monitoring. Who does the monitoring? Or the range of users do their own monitoring?
Very good question. We also had a discussion about that. That it's important to distinguish between the collection of the data, then you can categorize them in different ways, and the analysis of the data. So you can do your best to put out neutral data that is then analyzed by a whole different range of stakeholders for their specific purposes, or you can have targeted data for specific use. So, for example, if you produce specific information that Parliament needs to hold their governments to account to respond to a specific task. So both in our discussion had their function.
So what about the biases in data collection? And
Sorry?
the biases, you know, we can perhaps work out what some of the biases are. You mentioned gender. We can look at, you know, other biases such as language, where we have a huge amount of information in this field in the English language. As a result, certain assumptions dominate and are not challenged, whereas we have a deficit of data in, for example, Chinese and Russian and so on. So how do we manage that? And how do you work out what the biases that you don't know about? How do you deal with those? How do you account for those?
It's a really good question. We also started discussing that, and there were several ideas that came up. One of them was also not just to look at the specific data that you want to use in your methodology, but also consider data that may not be directly relevant, because it may turn out to be relevant if you're more open-minded about it and less close-minded. But also a lot of critical reflection about trying to analyze what may be the bias that has gone into your question, and being clear about the research question that you're asking, and how you use data to respond to that. And one other way that was also raised is by having different data sources and data providers, because the more you have, the more you can cross-check about the way different data sets are done.
Or the more you can confirm bias.
Yes.
I mean, bias confirmation is one of the big problems that we have. So we think we're triangulating. We think we're cross-checking, whereas actually we're confirming bias. So it's even worse. We've done something to try to prevent bias, and we've actually increased our bias.
I think one of the things, I mean, we just started discussing it. I think it's something that would be really worth taking forward also as a future process. And I think it would require having a group of very diverse stakeholders, because you need people who may actually detect bias. And if you have a group of very like-minded people, they're less likely to come up with identifying the bias. So if you have not just data providers who are concentrated in certain organizations, certain countries, certain regions, but diversify that, I think you reduce the bias. And by having explicitly groups that may be challenging certain assumptions.
And also that you
Gender
have
balance.
in each you have gender balance.
Yes.
Otherwise you end up, as my colleague says, with a room full of very diverse men. So.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
Sabina.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we've now got soft law, standards and codes. Group 4. Daniel.
His was the most popular group, by the way. I thought there were the largest number of people in this group.
It's the word soft that does it, I think.
I see.
So we're going to be hard on you, though, Daniel.
Okay, this is not at all intimidating.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Daniel Feeks. I'm now the head of the Implementation Support Unit for the Biological Weapons Convention, based here in the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs in Geneva. So yeah, first of all, thanks to all of the people that turned up for our group. We did have quite a few people in the room, many of whom came back today as well, so we were very pleased about that too. And also thanks to Ursula, who was taking very comprehensive notes during both days of discussion as well. So this is about soft law, standards and codes. So we spent a lot of time yesterday really getting into the subject and discussing kind of definitional issues really. Also looking at whether soft law and hard law together, whether soft law is an alternative, whether it's a complement to hard law. It was stated by some that many states actually prefer the hard law approach with legally binding instruments, compliance mechanisms, enforcement and so on. Some even see that soft law could even be a distraction from hard law as well, whereas others see soft law as a first step until the international community is actually ready to negotiate hard law through legally binding treaties. It was also pointed out that soft law can also be used to build consensus around a particular issue. And of course, then it was pointed out that there are many examples in many fields where you have both soft and hard law operating at the same time and complementing each other. We then discussed about the scope of governance, looking at like soft law for who are the actual actors involved, who are the subjects in a way of soft law. Looking at examples of soft law instruments working between states, different kinds of codes, etc. But also, we spent quite a lot of time talking about soft law as a way to reach and to engage with non-state actors as well. So with the private sector, with industry, for example, with scientists, and so on as well. And also the use of soft law, particularly when talking about codes of conduct as an educational tool as well. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. We also reflected quite a lot on the complexity of governance, particularly with regard to issues about emerging technologies. And this particularly came out, I think, when we were talking about industry and the involvement of industry, where, you can talk, and quite clearly define sort of traditional defense industry. The industries, the companies which are, identifiable companies making tangible products which are actually, in all senses of the word, weapons. Whereas nowadays, particularly in the emerging tech area, you have companies working on products, on technologies which may not be tangible. They may be dual-use products. They may not even at the moment know exactly what end uses those products or those technologies will actually be put to. They may not be apparent yet. It was, very clear from the discussions that obviously private industry should be involved in these discussions, and we talked about some examples, for example, with regard to tobacco control, for example, and the role that industry had played there. Lots of discussion. This is one of, to me at least, this was one of the key things that came out from this discussion, and something that we haven't really focused on that much in the areas that I've dealt with before, chemical and biological weapons, was about the role of financial institutions and also the role of insurance companies as well. There's been a little bit of discussion lately about insurance companies in the bio area, so that for me was something particularly interesting. We also talked about the issues of diversion, shipping, these kind of transfers and issues that are going on there. There was an example given about self-governance at the industry level when it comes to gene sequencing. Many companies that are working on synthesizing DNA have actually got together and established their own consortium to ensure that the sequences aren't given to people who may have malicious intent. We then discussed issues of accountability. I mean, states themselves as kind of traditional actors in the international system with recognized legitimacy. So then we discussed the legitimacy of other actors, industry itself, civil society. It was noted that obviously not all civil society is by definition good either. The example was given of the NRA in the United States. Also the ambiguity as to how to engage the private sector and how to change behaviors. So, what are the ways to make companies actually change their minds, change their behaviors and practices? We talked about indices, we talked about the involvement of civil society, reputational issues, incentives, pressure from shareholders and so on. An issue that's come up before, I think, in a couple of the other groups, how to actually get involvement on this issue, how to get people to prioritize disarmament in a way that's comparable to climate emergency, particularly for younger people as well. Another one, a kind of key area, was a big discussion we had this morning about ethics as well, and the use of ethics, the use of codes and standards as a kind of as an educational tool. There was an example given that after the 2008 financial crisis, all business schools are now required to teach their students ethics, which again is something that could be taken into our areas as well. In the bio area, we've had lots of discussions about ethics and education, particularly the basic need to make scientists think of the future applications and uses of their technologies and the implications of those. Final points. It was also stated that in some areas, we don't need more soft law. There's already quite a lot going on, but it may need to be better articulated. And then also we had this discussion about the need for champions, this issue of discussion about we need a Greta, but also the point was made that you need these at local, national, regional and global levels, and also that the champions also need to reflect different cultures, different nationalities and everything as well. It's very hard for one individual to represent everybody. But then we also discussed institutions. It's not just about individuals, also about institutions and how that they need to walk the walk. They need to be strengthened themselves and need to be engaged with more holistically. Now, obviously, there's a lot more that we discussed. I've probably not done justice to everything that we discussed, but hopefully that gives you an idea, at least as a snapshot. And now I'm sure you're both going to ask me difficult questions. Thank you.
Flinching there.
Well, since you belong to the biological BWC fraternity, you also see a curious phenomena, and I wonder if you talked about it. The BWC lacks verification. There was an exercise over many years which tried to build up a verification regime, so to add on in terms of hard law, because treaty law by definition, I suppose you would classify as hard law. But then that failed, and so therefore you are left with some soft law that you mentioned dealing with today's technology. So, but when you look at soft law, because you have failed at a hard law, it has a different political connotation as compared to soft law, which you are trying to originate in issues like, say, artificial intelligence, where so far there is no framework because terms of reference haven't been fixed. So the politics of the two are very different. I don't know if that got any consideration in your group, or what you think about it.
Yeah, no, we had some discussion around that, and I think you're right. We have a treaty already, the Biological Weapons Convention, which has been there for over 40 years. And as you mentioned, we had a process during the 1990s to try and strengthen that treaty through, that would have been through hard law. Whereas now we're much more, the process is much more focusing on these kind of soft law. And you can look at other elements of the BWC regime as soft law, also confidence building measures, for example. Most of the BWC regime, as it's developed, as it's evolved, is based on soft law because the treaty itself is so short. So yeah, I think the BWC is one of these areas where you have this mix, soft law and hard law working together and basically complementing each other. There's obviously the tension that you referred to as well, that some states still want to return, to that hard law approach and have a new, something supplementary, hard law supplement to the BWC as well.
So does soft law coming in a place like the BWC, which is actually hard law, does it end up weakening the hard law?
Personally, I don't think so. I think it complements it, but others may have different views on that as well. I think you need, we spoke also a bit about implementation of treaties, how you often have a big campaign for a treaty, a lobby to get a treaty approved and negotiated, and then that campaign kind of fizzles away, and then there's a lot less focus on implementation. But implementation is actually the very important part, and that's where soft law is also quite key in the implementation phase as well.
Rakesh and I are both physicists, right? So we're thinking this is a hysteresis curve, right? It's a phase transition curve. So if you're going from phase of hard law and it becomes soft law, that's a very different pathway to the soft law through to hard law. And that's, I think, the point you're making. And I think it's an important point. And can I talk about insurance for a minute? Because I've been doing a lot of work with insurance companies lately. And my interest in them, and it seems like yours is too, and in the group, is as a driver of behavior. So in areas where you are required to have insurance, and that's many areas in industry, then the insurance companies can actually develop mechanisms to force you into certain good behavior. And we've developed a scheme with an insurance company where we've gone for what we call red, amber, green. So red, you can't get insurance. Amber, you've got a few things to do. Green, you can. But then we don't want to stop there. So we've now developed this bronze, silver, gold. So you get to green, you get insured. But if you go to bronze, silver, and gold, you start to get some extra benefits. Reductions in premiums, maybe a special blue shield on whatever, on your website, whatever. Some kind of mark of good behavior. And has this been investigated for, you mentioned the bio side, what about some of the other?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it was something that really came out from the discussion for me personally, at least anyway, was this issue I hadn't really considered. I know it had been considered a bit already, so I don't know that much about it. I'd be interested to, hear more about what you just described. But I know that, something else that's going on in the bio area is related to what you just said about this kind of seal of approval, that there are some people who are looking for some kind of biosecurity seal or something like that. It relates a little bit to the self-governance for the gene sequencing companies that I mentioned before, but so that there could be some kind of a scheme where companies would go through some kind of certification process and then they would be awarded this seal by, there's questions about who sets the rules and who awards the seal and everything. But
We've been doing it for cybersecurity in industry, and it's proven to be quite effective.
Yeah, exactly. So it may be something that can be mapped across to this area as well.
Great, thank you, Daniel.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.
Thank you.
Well, we've got 15 minutes for the last one. Yeah. So good. Well done, everybody. Really excellent, concise reporting. So last group, forecasting and adaptation.
Sorry, I'm actually coming here to represent the group, not for a housekeeping announcement.
No need to introduce yourself.
Oh, yes. So our group on forecasting and adaptation started with identifying exactly what that meant. And so we narrowed it down to sort of three areas. One is, of course, the existing regimes and how do you strengthen their ability to better forecast and adapt to future risks. Second was to build a resilience of the international system itself, so not in the silos of the regimes as they exist, but collectively. And then in a more thematic sort of granular sense, what was the intention of doing this? It was not just to identify what the future risks are and where the evolution of weapons is going, but really to be able to map the landscape, to come up with prevention measures. How do we, already start thinking about dealing with them? How can we come up with new architectures of responding to these risks in terms of action? And how do we build compliance systems? And so this is the ecosystem of questions. When we started thinking about how to do it, there were a few questions that came up. One was, of course, any kind of future risk mapping or identification, there is this challenge of getting reliable information. And information flows are restricted in the security space, and much of it is controlled either by national defense systems with their sovereignty concerns or by non-state actors and cyber companies that can now sell to the highest bidder. There was also the question of incentivizing partnerships with the private sector, because when we talk about future risks like artificial intelligence and leaps in technology, a lot of it's the tech companies that are really holding the domain there. There was also the challenge of the decision-making architecture, because now the landscape has devolved not only to security threats or the conventionally belligerent actors, but if you have, the mercenary cyber hacker, how do we enforce, and what is the decision-making architecture there? So we came up with a model, actually, in terms of a concrete solution. For strengthening regimes, of course, there are processes that can be built into regimes, and there's also, as the previous group discussed, a space for a new law, new terms of reference, as you said, for AI and other risks. But we also saw there was an opportunity for the international community to organize itself in a similar pattern to the IPCC. So what in our group, of course this idea is not attributable to me, it's attributable to the group, a sort of intergovernmental process or panel on weapons governance. And again, the first question that arises is, we don't really need another body or another system. There's so many of them already, but we also come with a strong justification for why we need a body or a process like this. Firstly, because we see that climate action has benefited a lot from having a technical, scientific expert group that stands in isolation, not in isolation, but complementary to the diplomatic and politically challenging processes. So maybe we need some a holder of knowledge that's going to really process information that's out there and be the scientific authority and expert on what this landscape looks like. This would also be different from current regimes because it would bring the entire conversation together in an integrated manner. It would also actively seek out a phrase that we dislike very much, multi-stakeholder engagement, but it will be a process not only of governments, but of stakeholders at every level. Maybe the ILO is a good way to look at it, but also the IPCC. It would build capacities not only for future risks, but also of building the capacities of stakeholders on the ground. So in an active conflict situation, a challenge that regimes face is how do you, get knowledge about the evolving threats or the flow of weapons to build the capacity of those stakeholders. It would also, and finally, it would undertake public advocacy because, again, the climate action has benefited a lot from being able to just put the data out there so that the public can put pressure on governments. So, that's in a nutshell our argument, an IPWG to take up the work of
It's a brilliant idea. Absolutely brilliant idea. But some governments hate the IPCC, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
So how do we get over that? How do we kind of do it so that they don't realize that we don't call it the IPCC for weapons governance, obviously. What else do we do?
So we did, again, one of the justifications for doing, setting up a scientific body was to complement the works that governments are doing. One of the discussions we had is that national defense architecture is actually doing a great job to a certain extent, defending their populations against WMD, for instance. And so the justification really would be to add value to the work that the governments are doing. So this is not, unlike a purely UN kind of multilateral setup, which is just a talking shop for governments, and unlike a civil society effort, which is just advocacy and sometimes can ignore the self-interest of governments, this would be somewhere in the middle. So it's not, it's not like it's not an NGO that's standing from the outside and, marching against nuclear weapons, and it's not a governmental body either, but it would have, it would add value to the work of both of those pillars.
So, did you give any thought as to whether something like this, whether it would deal with existing threats like nuclear weapons? Because here is an area which is where the governments are pretty well entrenched, and they are unlikely to take kindly to, any intrusion on what they consider to be their sovereign preserve, or as compared to, let's say, new technologies which are more amorphous and therefore more susceptible perhaps to persuasion through a forum like this. Was there any thought on that?
That's an excellent point. And again, then when we were thinking about forecasting as the topic for the group, one is, of course, to be able to forecast threats within the current existing landscape of weapons. And the second is to imagine what future threats look like depending on the current trajectory in the exponential growth of technology. And one of the strengths of an organization like this is that it will bring those conversations together and be the holder of knowledge on AI and future threats in a way that the siloed organizations that we currently have, whether it's on chemical or biological or nuclear, are not doing in conversation with each other. I mean, of course they are. There are dialogues and there are processes, but this, as a scientific advisory group, IPCC with all its gaps would be something like that, which would bring the whole climate/weapons governance conversation together.
Does it remind you of the UNSG's Disarmament Advisory Group, Patricia?
It reminds me of a lot of groups, but so one of the critical difficulties with this doesn't mean, I think it is a brilliant idea and I think we should do it, but one of the critical difficulties is that the scientists may not come up with the ideas that everybody likes. And we've seen some scientific bodies come up with quite different outcomes from what the disarmament community would like. So there are we need to think all of that through, but the most important thing is with the IPCC is that it is independent and it does come out with things. It's not in the pocket of the activists, it's not in the pocket of government. That's the critical thing. And so if we can do that, that could work really well. But it might not come out with what the activists want always.
That's true. That's a balance that's tricky. But if we can do it,
it's great.
In some ways, it kind of links up with the working group 2 that Ben had, where he was talking of a declaration. And so, did you also talk of champion countries to, take this idea of an IPCC clone forward?
We did have a discussion on exactly where this process would be pushed from, and. Of course, you need champion countries to give it form if it's going to be an intergovernmental process. But the very fact that I think the origin point of this would be to get the technical experts together, and then whoever is willing to listen and offer the organization the independence that it needs would be the champion country. But we didn't discuss who those champions might be.
Okay.
So we've got 5 minutes left for questions,
Well,
that's all. That's not very good, is it?
10 minutes or something.
10 minutes maybe, what do you think? How hungry are people?
Shall I return to my...
Stay. Okay. Otherwise we've got a weird gap.
Okay.
So anybody like to take the floor, add something, challenge something, disagree with something?
Suggest more ideas.
Richard?
Thanks to everyone who presented and to the moderators for their probing interrogation. But there's some really good ideas coming out here, and I'll be very excited to work with our colleagues at the Global Challenges Foundation to think about how we can take them forward, and that's indeed a topic for those who want to stay for the brainstorming this afternoon. We can discuss that. But with all of these, it's the question that always comes up to my mind is, how do you get them started? I mean, who's going to lead this? Who's going to take the first step? What forum can we use to get this moving? Because I've been to all kinds of conferences and meetings, and people come up with great ideas quite often, and everyone gets a bit excited for a while, but then nothing really gets off the ground. Clearly, you need funding, you need political commitment from at least a few governments. You need a reasonably coherent idea to start with everyone involved having the same goals, or at least compatible goals. So, I mean, I'm not expecting you to answer this now, but maybe this is something we can discuss in the brainstorming session this afternoon, is okay, how to actually get these things off the ground. Thanks.
Yeah.
So can I just check, Richard, because a number of people have asked me and I haven't known the answer. For the 2 o'clock extra brainstorming session, is that open to everybody?
Yes, that is open to everybody. It's voluntary.
This wasn't voluntary, by the way. This was compulsory.
This part was compulsory. No, this when we designed the program, we understood that a lot of people would have planes to catch or things they needed to attend to in the afternoon, so we didn't want to make people feel obliged to stay all day. But for those who are here and available and interested in exploring how we can take these ideas further, please do join us at 2 o'clock in room 18, because we'll have we'll see how many of us there are, and then we'll see what we can do. It's open to everyone, yes.
Yeah, I think.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentations. I think it's really interesting ideas, and not the least the last one with having some sort of weapons governance like the IPCC. I was also partly in that group, but to make it even more difficult that we can take with us and perhaps not solve here. I mean, the IPCC works very good, but when they are presenting their ideas, what we lack is decision-making around them, and architecture for governance. So I think, seeing from the Global Challenges Foundation, that is the core of our interests. But of course, we need to build all the steps there that we are discussing here on how to collect data, how to form the society, how to have an IPCC-like body that could point out the risks. But then the very hard questions remain on, do we have an architecture that could take effective decisions on these risks that are identified?
Want to answer that?
Any thoughts? Yes, that's true, because ultimately the IPCC generates a whole amount of data, information, analysis, but then it falls to the governments to take a decision on climate change, on limits, and so on and so on. So,
although, you know, the COPs are very multi-stakeholder, aren't they? I mean, everybody's there, everybody's engaged. And climate activists within their countries are very engaged with government. So if there's anything we can take from that, I think that might work quite well. Not least of which is the energy and enthusiasm within that.
in one of the groups, I think I heard a phrase called intersecting networks. So I forget which group it was, but I mean, you know, this is a little bit like that. Different networks, they intersect along areas.
So we have Raji, and then Susie, and then Hillary. Yeah. Raji, do you want to introduce yourself as well, in case people don't?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Raji Rajagopalan. I'm a distinguished fellow, and I head the Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation. So the question, I think a couple of different discussions focused on having scientific and others kind of steering groups to put together or bring back the discussions to focus. But I think in the recent, at least a decade or so, the main problems have been political in nature. So, and that has to be, once again, placed back in the context of the changing balance of power equations, and that has had a determining say in the and the tone and tenor, as well as the pace at which we have been able to pursue global governance debates. So I'm not entirely certain that these steering groups outside of the governance structures, traditional structures, would aid or make progress in overcoming some of the political challenges. Like I said in the subgroup meeting, I think there are 3 stages when you come to develop a core soft law or a hard law. You have the technical challenges, technical discussions. Then you have the legal debates as to what the states are committing themselves to. And then finally comes the political issues. And I think in the current circumstances especially, the political issues are the most important ones, determining a country's agreement to a particular future path, and so on and so forth. So steering groups or the civil society groups all are important, but at the same time, how do they actually give traction to the political challenge, or at least give way, some sort of allow for making progress in the way of getting over the political issues. I think that's been my troubling issue for quite some time now, dealing with some of the global governance debates. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if I can take that on a bit further, I think one of the problems that we often have is, we can do all this scientific work, we can create knowledge, we can map, we can analyze, we can present, and then the facts are not taken up and the politics dominates. If we then try to modify what we do to fit the politics, and I've seen many do that, you run even a bigger risk, right? You start to become essentially co-opted into that frame of thinking. And I think I've seen that happen with a number of non-governmental organizations in, for example, the US, where they're more or less a mouthpiece for the government at many stages, as opposed to an independent body. So it's really difficult to know how much you can, in order to get something done, how much you have to adapt your ways of what you're trying to say to get some action. Because, of course, some action is better than no action. It's a very difficult one, I think, for non-governmental organizations and academics. Thank you, Raji. Susie.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the really great ideas that have been put forward here today. I'm Susie Snyder from the organization PAX in the Netherlands. Just thinking about this and thinking about how to bring some of the practical short-term application of what I've heard here today, and looking at how we can both feed in and feed back to different existing weapons governance discussions, right? We've heard from a number of treaty body groups. We heard from Bioweapons Implementation Support Unit. There's, cluster munitions has a similar support unit. There are existing bodies established to facilitate the norm building, strengthening, and monitor and assess the implementation of various treaties. Now, is there a moment, and I honestly don't know, where they all kind of sit together for a second and address trends, challenges, and actually just de-silo for a second, zoom out and say, oh, well, overwhelmingly we're seeing an uptick on this type of issue and a downturn on this type of issue. People like, some on-site inspections, people are hating to do clearance. I don't know, that type of thing. We can use blockchain to modify and mark where we've cleared already. That type of question. And I wonder about this, and in this idea of IPCC for, weapons governance, that might be a small conference or conversation that could help, broaden this a little bit further. Thanks.
Thanks. And then we've got Hilary.
Hi, thank you. It was interesting to me thinking how these things have connected to 3 areas of work, and so much, I think, information and help and collaboration can be done to help you guys. A lot of this, I'm involved in a project on what I'm never going to call multi-stakeholder governance. Again, it's going to be collaborative governance from now on. But there's a lot of work, as you say, on the internet, governance regimes, lots of the soft law governance that I think can be brought to bear on this. I think there's also, I'm now on this working on reforming agile governance, which is another dreadful, made-up load of a rubbish word. But actually, I think there's some new thinking from that land, I think, that can, help with weapons governance. But also, I'm still minded, it comes town and town again to that point that you just made. It's what we're asking people to do with this is listen and act to the opinion of somebody whose opinion they don't value at all. And how do we do that? How do we break through all of our, sort of ingrained need to, inability, and how difficult it is to listen and act on the part of, and on the way of these sorts of different challenging perspectives which just don't fit with the way we think should be. And that's NGOs, business, governments, everybody. And it's the same in every single sphere of governance. It's really, really difficult, but that comes back time and time again. And I'd be really interested if anyone's got any thinking on what works and doesn't work in that sort of sphere. It'd be very fascinating to know.
I think that's really, as well, so all this discussion about a champion, as if nobody talked about climate change before Greta Thunberg, right? Really? Yeah, I know. But it's interesting how that's happened. So she obviously heard about climate change as a result of all of the work that was going on, and she embodies youth and directness, which I think has been very refreshing. But it wasn't that nothing was going on before her. And if we imagine that ourselves and think that we can't do anything without champions and white knight to come and save us, you know, then we are really in a very strange environment. So I think we need to think perhaps in the way that we talked about earlier about champions at every level. And everyone is a potential champion. Think of it that way, perhaps. I think saw another hand here, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think this was a very interesting discussion. One part that I found very interesting was the role actually regional institutions can play. And you know, along with advocacy, you need regional institutions because they can very often help in consensus building, which is very often a very big challenge in these situations. So what if we had a platform which brought together, which is coordinated by regional institutions, we invest in their capacity building, we invest in their strengthening those institutions, bring actors together, and then have this discussion, invest in consensus building, and understand that there is no silver bullet. Every solution has to be customized slightly. You know, when you're talking to the private sector, you have to customize the way you talk to them. You have to ensure that they understand, you know, what are the synergies. You bring, you know, going back to Lema, Mrs. Gobovi's talk yesterday, she talked about bringing the people who are affected. You know, so having a platform coordinated by regional institutions for consensus building that engages in communities, engages civil society, private sector, as well as the governments. So I think that's also something that can be potentially helpful.
That's an interesting idea. Although, when you look at regional institutions, you will also then come face to face with regional disparities. So in today's digitalized world, when you look at that, that brings in another set of complicated issues. But anyway, is there any other question? Otherwise, we can bring this concluding session to a close because there is another side event that is planned. Okay, well, thank you, Patricia.
Thanks,
and
Rakesh.
thank you to all the 5 coordinators who came and sat in the hot seat. And thanks to all of you for listening to us patiently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sood and Dr. Lewis. There is a side session that begins now in rooms 7 and 8 on the humanitarian aspects of this conversation. So we have to wrap this up very quickly. I'm going to leave the stage with Richard and Jens, who will make some closing remarks before we break. And then we also have lunch now, and brainstorming starts at 2. Sorry, I just ran through those announcements.
Yeah. Thanks, Nabila. Thank you all. We'll keep this very short because there's a side event starting right now, essentially, upstairs. Please do look in at that. It's on the intersection of human rights and weapons issues. But this is the end of the formal part of this conference, this New Shape Forum. So I just wanted to thank you on behalf of the Geneva Disarmament Platform for participating. Thank you especially to our moderators and facilitators and chairs, and to Nabila, who's done a great job as MC. I personally found it fascinating, some of the ideas that have come up and some of the discussions we've had, so thank you very much for contributing to that. There will be more. Please join us if you can for the brainstorming this afternoon, and you'll be hearing from us on next steps. And let me hand over to Jens.
Yes. Thank you very much, and thanks for good cooperation. This is the second New Shape Forum that we are actually arranging, and yet let me say a little bit about the outcome of the first one. What that gave us was a lot of partnerships that is now working out there, and maybe you also want to partner up with some of them. And I just wanted to introduce to you some of our partners that works, and one of them we saw here on stage, that's Ben Donaldson from Together First. It's not Sweden first, not Switzerland first, but Together First. And that will be a dialogue globally on reform ideas up to UN 75, and also perhaps turning into a campaign. Yeah, we know you, Ben, from now. And another thing that I would like to present to you is that we also are working with a more radical, holistic idea. And that is an idea that is carried out by Maya Groff and Augusto Lopez. But could you rise if you may, because that idea is also on our web page. And if you have critical ideas or anything about that idea, please use our web page and return to us and to them. I also wanted to, of course, there's so many people we work with, but we also have a global policy dialogue that is going on also up to UN 25. And here's an important partner, and that's Richard Poncio from the Stimson Center. And there are other stakeholders in that dialogue, and that will continue. And you will, in Stimson Center's homepage, you can see where we meet and what we discuss, and you can also be a part of that discussion. I also would like to say from the GCF point of view that we will carry on this, and especially together with Sofia Norberg and Magnus Giborn, we will take up ideas from this conference to see what will be the new partnerships. But the very special thank I would like to give to those who organized this event. That's Richard, that is Maria Loddo from Geneva, the Disarmament Project, and that is especially from Global Challenges Foundation, Kate Sullivan and Raquel Benito. I think you've done an excellent job. And for many years I worked with and as moderator, and I'm so happy that we had the possibility to work with you, Nabila Yomshed, as a very good moderator and facilitator. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and please do grab a sandwich, head upstairs for the side event if you're interested, and thanks again.